Hey, greetings, friends. This is Bob Enos coming at you from studio for, I don't even know, 6th, 7th version of Willmar Tyranny. I might be kind of running a little fast today because I seem to be the busiest semi-retired guy that I know. I lost some help from my personal caregiving help for my brother this past week, so I'm really running full steam. But I've got 4 things on my agenda today that I hope you're going to find interesting. I sure am, and I'll let you know right now the order of my itinerary. First thing I'd like to talk about is a wrap-up on the town hall event that was staged about a week ago now at the Skylark Mall, during which our state representative Dave Baker and State Senator Andrew Lang showed up in part to give us a legislative update. More importantly, to sort of take the heat and the flack, in particular for Mr. Baker's position on that very controversial House bill, goes by the number HF 1500, which would bestow special driver's license privileges to what I still call and what the United States Penal Code still calls illegal aliens. So the first item on our agenda is to wrap up some details on that event. The second thing I'd like to talk to you about is the proposal that for a new city hall that could very much, we could very much be looking at sort of the conclusion to this epic boondoggle of Mayor Calvin's and Council Member Kathy Schwante's. It's set to go to a public meeting at the upcoming City Council meeting on Monday. If you have something to say, friends, this is the time to say it. Don't be complaining about this after the deal is done. Third item I'd like to speak about is sort of a little legislative analysis that I did with regard to this legislative session in St. Paul and what both Dave Baker and Andrew Lang have been up to in terms of what kinds of bills they've been signing on to, who they've been signing on to them with, what their priorities seem to look like in view of the bills that they've taken on, and little prediction about what I think we might be seeing coming off of all of this in preparation for the upcoming election cycle next year. So a lot on the plate. I'll try to move quickly because our gracious host Rudy has promises to keep, so I don't want to keep him waiting. So let's get to the Skylark Mall business. And I'm going to highlight something kind of got my goat here. That hardly ever happens, right? And it had to do with a posting on Facebook. Many of you know that I'm quite active as a political commentator on Facebook, and I got a little bit of a pushback. And it was from an unexpected quarter. It was from the Facebook page that represents the Candy Ojai County Republican Committee. Those are what in political parlance are known as BPOUs. Funny little name. It stands, not the Elks now, it stands for Basic Political Operating Unit. It's the very most basic grassroots expression of democratic political organizing at city and county levels. So the Candy Ojai County BPOU, as I said, has a Facebook page, and it seemed to take an oblique poke at me after this Skylark Town Hall business. Let me first tell you what it says, and then tell you why it got my goat. And this was on April the 14th. I can't remember the day that event took place, but this isn't far after. Never mentions my name, but for anybody who's sort of on the inside of these discussions, there won't be any surprise as to who they're talking about. And the posting says, there are some rumors going around about the driver's license bill Representative Baker voted for. Please keep in mind that the amended bill has yet to make it onto the legislative website for either chamber. Anyone referencing the current online versions and touting them as the final bill are fake news. For the people wanting to follow the bill in the Senate, HF 1500 was introduced, this is what they call a companion bill in the other house, was introduced as SF 2813. That's the Senate version of the bill that the House recently approved, with Representative Baker's yes vote. And we'll get to that in a moment. And then what is further included is a YouTube video of, I guess, I didn't watch it, I guess, of Dave Baker talking smart, maybe? I don't know. Here's the thing, folks. Let's talk about this fake news thing first. If this was indeed fake news, it wasn't my fake news. You don't shoot the messenger. The things that I report, as I'm sure most of you know by now, come from an awful lot of research on my part. The amended bill that the House voted on with Dave Baker's help, I saw, and it was called the third engrossment, which means basically the third version. And it was the latest version at that point of the House bill that Mr. Baker voted on. I believe it was posted on to what's called the Office of the Reviser. That's the office in the legislature that tracks and posts all the minutiae with respect to how these bills go through their processes, from submission to committees, to amendments, blah, 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 everything. So that's where I got my information. So if the Candioi County Republican Board has an axe to grind about the accuracy of my news, they needn't talk to me, although that would have been nice. They should get in touch with the Office of the Reviser, because if there was fake news out there, they put it out there, not me. And by the way, it wasn't fake news. But here is the fake news that was put out. At that Skylark presentation where we listened to Misters Baker and Lang, Baker left us with the impression that somehow he had offered up an amendment that doctored the bill, that took away one very especially offensive piece of language in that bill. And here's what it was. There was what was called a protected privacy component added at the end of the bill. And here's what that said. Suppose I'm a Willmar police officer and I pull over a woman at a traffic stop, and when I look at her driver's license, I see that it's the specially designated driver's license that's issued to illegal aliens. The earlier version of the bill said that even though I'm a police officer, the only thing that I can use that information for is to complete my traffic stop and to make sure that I am enforcing the rules of public safety with respect to road safety. If as a police officer, knowing that that person is in the country illegally, I cannot, according to this bill, I cannot share that information with any other unit of government. I can't report it to ICE, I can't report it to Border Patrol, I can't report it to the state police, I can't report it to anyone. And according to the first version of the bill, if I do report it as a police officer, I can be fined $10,000. So Representative Baker jumped up on the dais and said that thanks to him, that was removed from the bill. That was fake news, friend. The only thing that was removed from the third engrossment, the final amended version of the House bill, remember, it isn't law, this is just the House bill. The only thing that was removed was the $10,000 fine. However, the bill said that it was still illegal for anyone who procured information on immigration, illegal immigration status. It was still illegal to report and share that information with any unit of government, including law enforcement. So the only thing that was removed and left murky was what the penalty for violating that piece of the bill would be. So just so that we clear all of that up. And I should say, I know who does the postings for this Candido County Republican group. It's a little young snot-nosed wannabe leader who just wants to rub elbows with people in the positions of power. I don't fault him for having his own opinion. I do fault him for not being man enough to talk about it with me privately. The BPOU, the Candido County Republicans, should take him to task for hiding behind their brand, if you will, with a computer without identifying himself. I wouldn't be too happy about that if I was on that board, and that's probably why it's very unlikely that I will ever support this BPOU again in any way unless they tighten up their ship. Right now they seem to be a ship adrift, and some of that adriftness has to do with the fact, well, two facts. Number one, we don't seem to have a very deep pool of talent in our county when it comes to people of conservative political thought. The second thing is, I think they are still reeling from the terrible routing and spanking that the Republicans took in Minnesota back in November. So I just wanted to get that out on the record. If I have no problem with anyone disagreeing with me. Come at me with the facts, be civil about it, and we can talk all day long. So that's all I need to say about that event. Okay, let's get on to the City Hall. You've probably been following the reports in the papers. The suggestion that the property adjacent to the fire station on First Street was Mayor Calvin and Miss Kathy Schwante's latest brainstorm on where a $10 million city hall that none of us have asked for should go. It didn't go well. That meeting didn't really go well for a number of reasons. It was very clear that not only was a majority of the public not sold on any of this, and again, this is passive-aggressive Minnesota. You're never going to see a lot of people jumping up and shouting down the proposal. At most, you'll see them politely sit there, I notice, and say nothing and hope it goes away. Obviously, Mr. Calvin isn't going away. But we're going to get to that a little later too. So when it became very clear that not only those assembled, which I figure were probably about, I don't know, 60 people, something like that, I'm not sure. The assembled people weren't overjoyed by this idea. Interestingly enough, the firefighters who were there didn't really seem to be too keen on having their turf nudged upon either. So you read reports the following day in our little hometown rag over here that the public spoke and the task force listened. BS. BS. I'll tell you what they didn't listen to. No, I'll tell you why they didn't listen. Because we never got a chance to speak. It was clear for anyone that listened to the show that was videotaped, people wanted to speak about this. They didn't want, and I don't think they necessarily wanted to speak to the gathered politicians, who, by the way, presented a quorum of city council members and a quorum of task force members, and we'll get to why that's so important. I made a claim during this meeting, and the newspaper picked it up, that this meeting, in large measure, was violating the state open meeting law, which has been in existence in Minnesota since 1957. Interestingly enough, the paper picked up on this. The young reporter, cub reporter Shelby Lindrad, I think is her name, and she said, "Well, Bob Enos says there's an open meetings violation, but he doesn't tell us exactly what the violation is." Well, Shelby, if you're listening, if you wanted to know, maybe you should have come over and asked me, because I would have told you, because I'll tell you now. So the good part about this meeting was that the only benefit that we had that we did not recognize and pick up on was that Mayor Calvin and Ms. Schwantes got us all together. Where we dropped the ball was here. We didn't need those people, those two political leaders, to give us permission to talk. They're not our mother and our father. They're not our bosses. They're not our keepers. They're our public servants, even though they don't really seem to get this. Where we dropped the ball, friends, was here's 60-odd people here that are all citizens. We don't really care what they say, do we? We really care how each other feel about this whole proposal. Because there are many people who are so shy they don't want to stand up and be counted first. But if they see that and hear that their neighbors share a similar point of view on this issue, all of a sudden, maybe they are willing to speak up. And that is why Mayor Calvin and Councilwoman Schwantes absolutely refused to pass a microphone around so that we could have a question and answer session that would be captured on the video camera and transmitted through Rack 8 to any household in the area, in the city, that had charter cable or whatever cable that wanted to see this. They didn't allow that. Instead, they said, well, instead of having a back and forth where we just have to go this way and that way, God forbid, why don't you just come up and speak with us privately? And bingo, that's where the open meetings law violation was most glaring. Now there's a lot of fact and fallacy with regard to what is covered by the open meeting law and what isn't covered. Because here's what happened, and I mean no disrespect to the fine people with this studio, because it had nothing to do with them. But at the point at which Mayor Calvin and Ms. Schwantes said, no microphone, you just come up and talk to us. Come on, don't be shy, come up. Well, the filmer, the videotaper, realized that there wasn't really a gathering to film anymore, so he turned it off. Which, if I was running it, I would have thought, well, the meeting's over. But the meeting wasn't over. Why wasn't the meeting over? Because even though everyone got up and milled about, there was still a majority, a quorum, of council members present in the room. And there was a quorum, a majority, of City Hall task force members in the room. And when you have the majority in a room, you cannot talk about government business, period. You can talk about the weather, you can talk about what you had for supper, you can talk about what you're going to do this weekend. What you can't discuss is city business, because at that point, you're having private conversations that are not documented for the record. There's no tape of them, there's no minutes, there's no recordings, there's nothing. So as citizens, you have no idea who's talking to who and what they're talking about. And that, friends, is a flagrant violation of the state open meetings law, and they know it. And I told them and stood up and said, you're violating the law if you don't pass that microphone. And they listened, and then they said, well, come on up front and we'll have some private conversations. From that point forward, everything that took place in that room was illegal. Now, I had a thought to file a complaint with the state agency that oversees these kinds of violations. It's called the Department of Administration. But here's the thing, friends. I could file a complaint and ask the commissioner to give us an opinion. But the opinion is a non-binding opinion. It has no force of law. And the opinion does not force a change in decisions that took place in that room. And I would have to pony up $200 to ask for this opinion. So, on balance, I thought it's just not worth it. The only opinion I really care about, friends, is yours and mine. Obviously, not Mayor Calvin's, because he has nobody's best interests at heart except for his very narrow base of insider supporters. Kathy Schwante's the same deal. So we are back to this. Oh, one other kind of interesting sidebar here. At some point, Mayor Calvin said, you know, this really isn't a new idea. This idea has been floated around. I've seen this idea for a city hall floated around Willmar since 2005. Now, isn't that interesting? In 2005, he didn't live in Willmar. He lived in his lake home, his $500,000 lake home on Lake Andrew and Spicer. So why would the goings-on of Willmar government concern a guy who, by all appearance, seemed to be retired, enjoying the good life back on the lake in Spicer? Question number two. Since, if in fact this idea began to be floated about town in 2005, 14 years ago, and if over 14 years the idea never ever got traction, then wouldn't you think that the people in charge would take that lack of traction for 14 years as evidence that neither the public nor the elected officials really had any interest in this thing? But here we are again. Now here's the third component of one more component. We've all bought, well, most of us have bought or sold houses, right? So you go and look at a house, you're thinking about buying it. What are some of the things that you look for when you talk to the real estate agent about the history of the house you're interested in? You want to know when it was last renovated. You want to know if it has water in the basement. You want to know if the roof is good, if the mechanical's good, if the heating, ventilation, air conditioning, electrical systems are good. When's the last time you replaced a roof? Yeah, I said that already. The point is, you want to know about the bones of that house, don't you? Now, what do we know about the city offices in terms of its state of repair? Well, the only thing we know for certain is that a third-party evaluator, a consultant, was hired to go through that building. And with the exception of, I guess, a leaking roof that has led to some water problems, the consultant really couldn't find anything wrong with that building. The building is worth, as we've said, just shy of $400,000. Now, here would be my question. I would love to put in a Data Practices Act request. It gets a little boring, but tiresome. I'd love to find out a maintenance history on that building. In other words, have you issued any work orders to departments in government, somebody in government that's responsible for the maintenance of city-owned properties? In other words, what have you done to take care of this building since Mayor Calvin's magic date of 2005? Can you show us any work orders? Can you show us any invoices? Can you show us any building permits? Can you show us any documentation at all of having done anything to maintain this building for the last 14 years? Or could it be possible that this last 14 years has been nothing but a period of planned obsolescence, where you could allow this $400,000 property to fall apart just to advance your argument that you need a new one? So, Mayor Calvin, Ms. Schwantes, why don't you do a little homework for that Monday meeting in preparation? Tell us what you've been doing with that building, or what the city's been doing with that building all these years. Now, we're seeing now that the fire station property has been shelved, sidelined, whatever, we're looking at, I guess, about 4 properties. The one that seems to make the most sense to this guy, that no one ever really wants to talk about, is fixing what you have and maybe doing a renovation. The first time I heard a suggestion of that was at a city council meeting a couple of months ago, maybe longer, offered up by the senior member of the city council, the mayor pro tem, one Rick Fagerly, who represents the ward in which I live. And Rick's a property appraiser, so, you know, he's probably the only one on that city council that has any knowledge about properties and construction at all. Not that he's a builder, but that's the other thing. You got these people playing construction expert that probably don't even know how to replace a light switch, but be that as it may. Rick said, you know, we could just fix the building, and currently the second floor only covers half of the first floor. In other words, half of the footprint of the entire building is the square footage for that second floor. Why don't we just extend that second floor further so that it covers the entire first floor? In the process, you've added about 25% of office space by doing so. And because it's located or separated from the auditorium just by a fairly narrow alley. And since the auditorium, by the way, has no elevator to my knowledge, and its upper floor probably has more than one floor, but the first floor, I don't even know if let's assume the first floor is wheelchair accessible. Certainly the upper floors aren't. So why don't we kill two birds with one stone, put in that, complete that second floor, the city offices have an elevator, and then construct a skywalk which would connect the second floor on the current city offices to the second floor of the auditorium. Now you not only have an improved office space for the city workers, but you've made the second floor of the auditorium accessible for those office spaces as well. And you could budget this thing for $1 million and probably do a heck of a bang-up job with it. Call it $2 million. It's sure a damn sight better than $10 million. And Mayor Calvin would also like for you to think that there's a $8, $9, $10 million line item in the 2019 budget. BS. There is not. There has not been. He talks about terms like, oh, we've got it bookmarked. I don't know what the hell bookmarked means. All I know is it's not in the budget. And if this gets approved, friends, you're going to be servicing a new mortgage. It's as simple as that. I won't be serving as very long because, mark my words, within 2 years, I'm out of here because I just can't take this anymore. So those are the kinds of things we'll be looking at. Oh, so one other property that's been put on the front burner all of a sudden is the property on Highway 12 that used to be the site for the Nelson Laundry. Nelson as in Councilwoman Audrey Nelson's husband's property. Duh, can you spell conflict of interest? Well, I don't even know why we're talking about this. Of course, I don't know why we're talking about any of it, because it's a huge distraction from the real problems and issues and challenges that face this town. But here we are wasting valuable energy over something we shouldn't be talking about when we have a mall that's pretty much on life support. It received how much of a tax abatement? I don't even know, but we know it's huge. Meanwhile, has a parking lot that you'd better not drive in when it's rained because some of those potholes are so large they'll swallow up your car. We've got a lot of problems here. Why are our elected officials putting all this energy, effort, and time into this nonsense when we have so many other issues to deal with? Is beyond me. So, those were two issues that I've knocked off the list. The town hall and the driver's license business and Dave Baker's part in it. By the way, there were 52 Republicans in the House that voted on that bill. 50 of those Republicans voted against giving driver's licenses to illegal aliens. 2 went with the Democrats. One of the 2, our RINO Republican representative, Dave Baker. And RINO means, quite simply, a Republican in name only. Third item on my agenda, and we're going to continue on now to the legislative session. You know, J.P. Cola, during the legislative session on KWLM, J.P. does a Saturday morning show with our delegation in St. Paul. Quite honestly, I never listen to it. Not because I'm not interested, but I'm doing my job as a caregiver on Saturday mornings, and I can't do both. So, to become more knowledgeable, I decided to do a little homework. And here was my goal. I wanted to look at both Dave Baker's records on voting, Andrew Lang's records on voting. I wanted to see, first of all, if I could glean from the bills they were voting on what their personal priorities are in terms of the things they're trying to get done through the legislative session. And I'd like to see who they're, in a sense, doing business with. Now, and what I mean by that is the way these bills are advanced, there's always a person, a single person that is called the chief author of a bill. I feel like I'm doing that Channel 2 How Does a Bill Get thing. You remember those? So you've got your chief author. Then your chief author kind of makes the rounds in whatever fashion they do, and he's asking for other legislators to become co-authors onto the bill. Ordinarily, I think they like to get a roughly equal representation of co-authors to a given bill from both parties. It looks good, right? I mean, it sounds good. So there were no real big surprises when I looked at Baker's activities, although it did give me more confirmation of what I suspect his ambitions are next year. The pleasant surprise that I got was from Andrew Lang. But let's start off talking about Mr. Baker's activities down there, and that'll give you a better sense of why, by contrast, Andrew Lang's activity this session has been so stellar. So let's start off with Mr. Baker. First of all, friends, Baker has co-authored, or has his name on, I should say. Baker has his name on 112 bills coming out of the House. Sounds like an enormous number, right? I mean, not as big as you'd think. There are probably a couple of thousand bills that come out of the House in the course of a session. I bet you, God, what do you think? Maybe 1% of them actually go anywhere? So much wasted time. But, you know, government's slow and plodding, but until we figure something better out, this is what we have. So let me give you the takeaways that I had from Mr. Baker's activities. First off, in looking at the issues that he seems to consider priorities, they're all over the place, honestly. A lot of just sort of basic nuts and bolts, what would you call it, administrative maintenance things that probably wouldn't mean anything to any of us, though certainly we know some of that minutia needs to be done, right? But they aren't the things that we read about in the paper that set us off one way or the other. What was interesting was that he's really seemed to make himself the poster child for the opioid epidemic crisis. And as we all know, his family has some personal exposure to that problem, you know, and you don't wish that on anybody, right? He has his name on, he has his signature, I believe, on how many? You know, I didn't write it down, but I'm pretty sure he has his signature on 16 bills that have to do with big pharmaceuticals, prescription drugs in general, prescription plans, hammering the pharmaceutical industry about price gouging, and opioid crisis, substance abuse management, all that kind of thing. That seems to be his rallying cry. I get that he's got a personal crusade with this, and I have to tread very lightly here because I don't mean to minimize the crisis nationally, although honestly I don't really know that much about it. But here's what I do know. It wasn't all that long ago that I went through the State Department of Health's death statistics by county, and I think I've told you this before, to see if I could get a handle on just how much this problem affects our county, Candioi County. And what I really learned was that the opioid crisis, as bad as it is primarily a metro problem, not an outstate problem. In the metro, something like 625 deaths in a year, maybe? Or maybe not that many. I saw a number, and I just can't remember what period of time it was now, but it was like 625 deaths were attributable to drug-related causes. Didn't say what kind of drugs, but let's assume, just for sake of discussion, say they were all opioids, although it didn't say that. And in the same period of time, the number of deaths attributable to drugs in our county, 4. So what I would say to Mr. Baker, if he were listening, is I get your passion. I get your personal connection to this issue, but you can connect with this issue other ways, Dave. You can connect with it by becoming a fundraiser for substance abuse agencies or for advocacy groups that take on these kinds of problems. Or you can try to be supportive of some of your Metro colleagues and get them to chiefly author some of these bills. But you don't want to make this star your own as a representative of Candiota County, because it then appears to people like me that you're representing your interests and not your district's interests. Unless you've been out to your district with a series of town halls and said, let me tell you why I think this is a big thing, folks, and let me ask you if you'll support me in going after this as an important priority for our county. I don't think you've done that. What I'm trying to say, Dave, is that in our form of government, much like we have in the city of Willmar here, your job is to speak on behalf of the people you represent. I mean, famine in Africa, big problem, right? Nobody expects you to be passing bills to, I don't know, marshal support for the famine in Africa, or for, you know, the civil war victims in Syria, because you don't represent them. You represent us, and you know what our issues are. And they're a lot bigger than the issues of some of your friends in the Chamber of Commerce or your family members that have been affected by the opioid problem and drug abuse. So, I'm done with that little tirade. So 60% of the bills that Dave signed on to were chiefly authored. Their chief authors were Democrats. Now, he might say to me today, well, Bob, I have to work across the aisle and blah, 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 and I suppose you do, Dave. But let's also realize that the agenda, and we know this from news every single day, the agenda for the DFL representatives in your House these days, presumably, is much different than the agenda for Republicans who believe in spending less, taxing less, small government, states' rights, and privatizing as much of public service as we possibly can. And did I say not spending so much? So, since we know from reading papers that the Democratic Party, following their spectacular wins in November, is going on a spending spree like drunken sailors in port, that leaves many of us wondering why you find it so easy to sign on with 60% as opposed to 40% Republican bills. And when we contrast that with the work that Andrew Lang's been doing, you're going to know what I'm talking about. So let me tell you about a couple of other standouts. I've already told you about the House Bill 1500 that Dave said was strictly a vote against his party because it was a vote in favor of public safety and keeping people like his family safe on the roads. I would ask you this: has anyone ever seen any data that suggests that that drivers who are, for instance, and let's face it, this is what we're talking about, people who have entered the country illegally from Mexico, is there some evidence that shows that they are more dangerous drivers than us? I would submit they're probably much safer drivers. And why? Because they don't want to be caught. And by the way, Dave, have you ever been to Mexico? Because newsflash, people drive cars in Mexico. People have car insurance in Mexico. People drive tractor trailers and move goods across state lines in Mexico. People have driver education in Mexico. It's a little bit condescending to make a case that somehow because they come from a developing country that they can't possibly know how to drive? Come on, come on. I mean, that's more racist than anything I've heard any conservatives say. So, we've talked about that rule. Dave said you can't use the driver's license issue to fix a broken immigration system, and proceeded to lay this all at the feet of Congress for not fixing the broken immigration system. Newsflash number 2, Dave, the immigration system is not broken. Immigration enforcement is what's broken. If we have 65-mile-an-hour speed limit on Highway 23, and that speed limit is never enforced, do you think there are going to be a lot of people out there violating the speed limit? And so it goes with immigration. The system is not broken. The unwillingness of states like Minnesota and California and Massachusetts and New York to enforce the law, that's the problem. That ICE's hands are tied due to bills like the one you signed off on that would not allow a local police officer to let ICE know that we have an illegal running around on the streets in Willmar. That's the problem. And you signed on to that problem, Dave. Let me tell you about one. I didn't bring the paper. Dave, here's something that you've been told, and I don't think that you understand, or you don't seem to acknowledge that you understand. There's a federal code called 8-US Code-1324, and that law has to do with the illegality and the punishment for harboring or transporting known illegal aliens in the United States. And what that code says, I'll have to paraphrase it. I meant to bring it and read it, and I forgot it. What that code says, friends, is that anyone who knowingly takes part in helping illegal aliens travel freely throughout the United States is guilty of a federal crime punishable by time in jail. Now, even if that bill did not pass, a case could be made in court that any state official, elected official, that signed on to that bill with the intent of helping illegal aliens transport around even the county is guilty of conspiracy to aid and abet, in many cases, a felon. And why do I say felon? Because if someone is picked up coming into the country from Mexico illegally, the first time they're picked up, that's a misdemeanor. Now let's suppose the person is deported and then they come in again, which we know happens. The second and subsequent time that person is picked up, they've committed a felony. You signed on to aid and abet the transportation of illegals who are felons in many cases around our county. You really need to think about that, because one of these days, someone's going to call you on all of it in a court of law. Okay, the standout for Mr. Baker. 60% of the bills he co-authored were chief-authored by Democrats. We've talked about the driver's license bill. Here's a cute one. This is called House Bill 1803. Provides $4 million worth of funding to an Hispanic advocacy organization out of St. Paul that goes by the acronym of CLUES, C-L-U-E-S. We're not really sure what that would exactly pay for, but here's what caught my eye on this, friends. And this was one of the few errors that Andrew Lang made, because he signed on to the Senate bill Senate version of this bill as well. Among its 4 or 5 stated objectives on its website for CLUES is to lobby to get driver's licenses for illegal aliens. More to the point, 2 issues. On their website is posted their audited annual financial statement for last year, friends. This group had reported total assets, a nonprofit advocacy group for Hispanic rights, had posted publicly assets of $10 million. Want me to say that again? $10 million. They also had a list of their benefactors and corporate contributors. It read like a who's who of the biggest and wealthiest corporations and philanthropic organizations in Minnesota. Companies like Best Buy, Cargill, 3M, who else? If you saw the names, you'd go, wow. And their philanthropic donors were philanthropies like the Bush Foundation, the McKnight Foundation, the Initiative Foundations, like I say, a who's who. So they have $10 million in the bank. And they have the kind of donor support where they can probably get another 10 million more. So regardless of what you feel about what they're doing, here is the question, Dave, and I put this question yesterday in a nice phone conversation with Mr. Lang. Why are you giving $4 million of tax goodies to a group that already has $10 million in the bank and the capacity to raise another 10 million more? If you think their work is great, that's one thing. But we don't use our tax money to give a tip to somebody for doing good work. That's not what these grants are for. These grants are for furthering work that a group can't do without some help. They obviously don't need any help. Now, if you're looking to make points with the Hispanic voting bloc in the Metro, Dave, I guess that would be a whole different thing, wouldn't it? So, House Bill number 786, the Neighborhood Development Center Grant. Andrew didn't sign on to this one, but Dave did, with a Democrat from the Metro. This would provide $2.6 million for business assistance, primarily, from what I see on the website for this group, primarily for Somali businesses trying to get off the ground in South Minneapolis. You see where this is going, friends? Where you're making alliances that, in the face of things, would have absolutely nothing to do with Kandiyohi County. Interestingly enough, one of the board members is a guy by the name of Asad Aliwed, Somali man, lives in Eden Prairie. He is the president of a charter school down in Eden Prairie called the New American Academy. He also ran unsuccessfully for the school district board in Eden Prairie. So that would lead one to think that he has political aspirations and maybe has a reach into the Somali community. He failed. He only ran once. He's also, as of November of 2018, has been chosen as what's called a Bush Fellow, meaning the Bush Foundation. For anybody that doesn't know anything about the Bush Foundation, there are two enormous philanthropic foundations in Minnesota. One is the Bush Foundation, one is the McKnight Foundation. One gentleman was the chairman of 3M, the other gentleman was, I believe, the president of 3M. And they have a very progressive agenda about developing leadership talent in the diverse communities. This guy has been sent, thanks to the Bush Foundation, to Africa to meet with heads of state and ministers of government. He also has 8 children, and also acknowledges that as things stand, being self-sufficient is one of his big challenges. Of course it is. He has 8 children. These are the kinds of networks that we seem to see Mr. Baker trying to infiltrate. And again, how does that further the interests of Kandiyohi County? If you figure that out, please let me know. What else do I have for Mr. Baker? House Bill 2614. This is called the Tipped Employee Two-Tiered Minimum Wage. A lot of people in the restaurant and hospitality businesses, they were thrilled that Dave championed this bill. And on the face of it, you can understand why. The premise of it was this, that the minimum wage for people in restaurant and hotel/hospitality industry should not be as high as the minimum wage for other sectors, because people that work in hospitality often receive their income through tips. So you go, okay, well, I can see the logic here. Maybe the minimum wage for all the sectors unfairly creates an advantage for people in an industry where you make some money off tips. So right now, if I'm not mistaken, the minimum wage in Minnesota is $9.50 an hour. So depending upon the size of the company in Minnesota, for an industry where its employees are known to make some of their income from tips, instead of getting $9.50 an hour, and depending upon how large the company is, this bill would have the minimum wage dropped for those people from anywhere from $6.50 an hour to $8 an hour. So think of that in terms of a 40-hour work week, friends. So instead of $9.50, let's just call it $10, because I want to round off. So instead, if you work in a gas station or convenience store and you work 40 hours a week, you make $400 a week, just shy of that. But if you work in Dave Baker's Super 8 motel, or Dave, housekeeping, or Dave Baker's Oaks restaurant over at the golf course, and if he makes at each of those businesses less than $500,000 a year, which I don't know, maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, but let's just say he makes less. He says he has 45 employees. I figure that means both places, and that doesn't seem like, well, I don't know. Here's my point. He'd only have to pay his people maybe as low as $6.50 an hour, which means at a 40-hour work week, let's round off to $7, because we did it for the others. So instead of making $400 a week, his people can make $280 a week. But here's the kicker. You say, well, Bob, they're receiving tips. Well, you know, if they're receiving, I don't know, $100 a day in tips, maybe that's not bad. And I'd say, yeah, it probably wouldn't be bad. But here's where his bill sets the threshold for a tipped employee. If the employee makes over $30 a month on tips, they're subject to a lower wage by as much as 30% less than the going minimum wage for the state. $30? That's not much more than $1 a day, friends. So if housekeeping in his motel, if she makes, I don't know, if she makes $10, if she makes $20 a week in tips, $80. Let's go. If she makes $20 a day in tips, that's, let's say for a 40-hour week, 5 days, 20 times 5, it's $100. So if she makes $100 in tips, that means instead of making $400, she's going to make $280. She's actually losing money. And why? Because there are so many people in the Chamber of Commerce and the tourism and hospitality industry. Doesn't really figure. But it does seem to help Mr. Baker. And wouldn't it maybe have made sense, even if it wasn't a legal issue, might it not have made sense for Dave to say, you know, this would have the appearance of me benefiting from a bill in terms of my business. So I think I'm going to abstain, much less sign the bill. Excuse me for one moment. Yeah. Okay. These are the details that get lost in the weeds, friends, because most of us, unlike me, probably have a busier life. They're not, you know, caregivers at home with a computer, and those are people you don't want to get on the wrong side of. So, do I have anything else I can tell you about? Oh yes, here we go. House Bill 2341, Hospitality Tourism Management grant program. I don't think I have to say anything more about that. Here's an interesting one. House Bill 1344 to a group called the Saneh Foundation, S-A-N-N-E-H. This isn't just a grant, this will provide permanent funding in perpetuity, as I read it, from the state. And this is a nonprofit group that promotes diversity through sports. I guess like if you placed soccer together, everybody will get along. And finally, Dave has put his name to House Bill 0040, which would restore voter rights to people who have been incarcerated in jail and been let out, serve their time. Sound like a Republican bill to you? You make of all of that what you will. He also seems to be kind of tight with a couple of fellow representatives that he's signed on more bills than most. One is the DFL Assistant Majority Leader, a woman of color named Alice Mann, who represents Burnsville and Lakeville. And then a woman by the name of Hodan Hassan. She is DFL also, and she represents South Minneapolis. So I would say that Dave's setting the table for something big. Now, here was the sleeper and the surprise, and such a surprise, that's okay, that I called Andrew Lang yesterday to eat a little crow. Because, you know, I've tended to, these guys seem to be joined at the hip an awful lot of the time, so I probably unfairly was painting them both with the same broad brush. But when I looked at Andrew's track record this session, I have to tell you, I was really impressed. Now, what would impress me? By the time I looked at all of the bills that Andrew has signed on to, unlike Dave's bills where 60% of the chief authors were Democrats, with the bills that Andrew has signed on to, 94% of the chief authors were Republican. Good job, Andrew. It shows that you are playing well with the people on the playground that you should be playing with. And as I looked at the kinds of bills that seemed to really have his focus, it came down to 4 or 5 areas. I looked at Dave's, they were all over the map, really, with the exception of, you know, the drug bills. But with Andrew, it was very clear that he had picked priority areas that I dare say would actually make sense for the kind of constituency that he represents in a rural district like ours. And they were dealing primarily with agriculture, wildlife management, firearms and gun safety, what else? Public safety, military and veterans affairs. Those were the 5 areas that had the lion's share of his attention when it came to signing on to bills. And the bills he was signing on to were Republican-led bills. And I got to tell you, he had a couple of clunkers that I wished he hadn't signed on to, and I told him so. One of them being that CLUES program there for the Hispanics that have $10 million in the bank. He kind of, I think he knew where he missed the boat there. But you know, as I've said today on Facebook, if we only work with legislators that believe in 100% of our given agendas, we'll never work with anybody. Because this democracy thing, friend, it's really messy. And as I said today, I kind of try to live my life by the 80% rule. If I can get close to 80% of what I'm looking for, whether it's house or health care or income or politics, I think I've had a good day. And I have to tell you today, the work Andrew Lang is doing, in my estimation, hits the 80 percentile. I wish he hadn't signed on to this CLUES program, but beyond that, I don't really have much of a problem with this guy. And he, by the way, has signed on to or authored himself 144 bills. So, oh, and one other area that really caught my eye, and I was glad to see him paying attention to, was this daycare fraud program. He has signed on to several bills and made public his belief that we can't turn a blind eye to fraud for anybody for any reason. You know, and in closing, I want to tell you about two websites that anybody who's really interested in more of a conservative perspective on current events in Minnesota ought to be watching. One of them is a group out of Wyzetta, a think tank, I would call it, that seems to be the go-to think tank from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune when they're looking for thoughtful op-ed pieces with the conservative bent. And that is a group called the Center for the American Experiment. I forget what the thing is, probably says that .org. I would look for them. They did a piece within the last couple of days having to do with the fraud program in daycare. And I like to think maybe that, you know, some of the things, we're friends on Facebook. I like to think that we're begging and borrowing ideas from one another. They acknowledged how ludicrous it is to have any program that would spend, any state program that would spend more in daycare than the mom is going to make on a job. And I would go one step further than to say maybe what we should be doing, instead of helping mom to go to work to make $1, the state should spend $5 in daycare so she can make $1. Why don't we find a way to incentivize those women with 7, 8, 9, 10 children to stay home and do the best job that they could ever do, which is bringing up their kids in a new country to become new, good, prosperous citizens. So look out for Center for the American Experiment. The other news blog I'd like you to take a look at is called Alpha News, A-L-P-H-A, Alpha News. Both of those, if you're tired of the liberal slant that we continuously see from our local rag and from the metro rags, this is a breath of fresh air. So I hope I haven't kept Rudy waiting, but I had my first motorcycle ride yesterday. I've been riding for 30 years, and to my fellow bikers, please be very, very careful. As I'm sure most of you know, this is the most dangerous time to be riding because we still have remnants of the sanding that took place from that blizzard a couple of weeks back. Very treacherous stuff if you're not careful. We need a couple of good rains and maybe the street sweeper to come through town again. So heads up, and as us bikers like to say, keep the black side down. See you, friends. Talk soon.